In the year 1906, Berlin stood at the crossroads of science and forbidden knowledge. The city was a hub for intellectuals, a place where the brightest minds from across Europe gathered to push the boundaries of human understanding. But beneath the sheen of academic achievements, the shadows of darker ambitions were quietly creeping into the corridors of research. For many, this was the golden age of scientific discovery, yet what was taking place behind closed doors was about to forever change the perception of what science was willing to sacrifice in the name of progress. Imagine a world where the lines between life and death are blurred, not by the forces of nature, but by the cold precision of human hands. The idea of creating life, of bringing something into existence that defied the natural order, was a concept that had both fascinated and terrified mankind for centuries. From the myth of Prometheus to the fictional accounts of Frankenstein, mankind had dreamed of mastering the secret of life itself. But what if those dreams were no longer confined to the pages of books or the imagination of poets? What if, in the heart of Berlin, a select group of scientists were determined to turn those dreams into a reality, regardless of the cost? At the center of this twisted narrative was an experiment that would remain classified for decades, its very existence hidden from the public eye. This was no ordinary scientific pursuit. It was a desperate attempt to manipulate the very essence of life. And it was not just about creating a new organism. It was about bending the laws of nature to suit human ambition. The idea of creating a living specimen, something between life and death, was an abomination in the eyes of many, but for the men behind the curtain, it was the pinnacle of scientific achievement. But what drove them to embark on such a risky and morally questionable path? What made these men, whose names would eventually be lost to time, believe that they could outsmart nature itself? Were they motivated by the promise of immortality, the hope of advancing humanity, or was it simply the thrill of playing God? Perhaps it was a combination of all these factors that pushed them beyond the edge of reason. To understand what led to this experiment, we must first consider the time in which it took place. The early 20th century was a period of scientific revolution. Breakthroughs in medicine, physics, and genetics were reshaping the way people understood the world around them. New technologies were emerging at an unprecedented pace, and scientists were starting to believe that they could conquer the mysteries of life itself. Yet, amid all these advances, the ethical foundations of science were still in their infancy. Science had the power to heal, but it also had the power to destroy. And as scientists sought to unlock the secrets of life, they also began to grapple with the consequences of tampering with those secrets. In Berlin, the intellectual climate was electric. The city had become a magnet for some of the most brilliant minds of the era, many of whom were working on projects that pushed the limits of scientific inquiry. Yet, there was a darker side to this intellectual hub. The thirst for knowledge was not always tempered by moral restraint. The pressure to achieve groundbreaking results often led scientists to take risks that would have been unimaginable just a few decades earlier. And this is where the experiment, hidden in the shadows, took root. The story of the classified experiment that produced a living specimen is one that has been buried in obscurity, its details kept from the public eye for decades. But as the veil begins to lift, the truth becomes chillingly clear. What happened in 1906 was not just a scientific achievement, it was an act of defiance against the natural world. In their quest for knowledge, these scientists were willing to push the boundaries of life and death, and in doing so, they opened a door that could never be closed. The experiment was shrouded in secrecy from the beginning. There were no public announcements, no grand proclamations of scientific progress. Instead, it was conducted behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of the media, the public, and most importantly, the ethical watchdogs of the scientific community. It was a project that was known only to a select few, and the results were meant to remain hidden, sealed away in a vault of silence. But why? Why go to such great lengths to keep the experiment a secret? What was so dangerous about what they were attempting to achieve that it had to be kept from the world? Perhaps the answer lies in the nature of the experiment itself. It was not merely an attempt to study the natural world, it was an attempt to control it. The goal was to create a living specimen, an organism that was neither fully alive nor fully dead, something that existed in a state of perpetual limbo. It was a concept that defied all known biological principles, a grotesque hybrid of science and necromancy. But the scientists behind the project believed that they could succeed where others had failed, that they could transcend the limitations of life and death. The result, however, was far from the clean, controlled success they had envisioned. What they created was not a marvel of science, but a horror. The living specimen was not a breakthrough, it was a monstrosity. It existed in a state of suspended animation, neither alive nor dead, trapped in a world that defied comprehension. It was a being that should not have existed, a perverse creation that was both a triumph and a tragedy. Yet, the story does not end with the creation of the living specimen. What followed was a series of events that would forever alter the course of scientific history. The scientists involved in the experiment were forced to confront the consequences of their actions, and the world was left to grapple with the ethical implications of what had been done. The experiment, once hidden in the shadows, would eventually come to light, but by then, the damage had already been done. The line between science and madness had been crossed, and there was no going back. The legacy of the experiment is one of secrecy, shame, and moral ambiguity. What began as a noble pursuit of knowledge quickly spiraled into something far darker. And as the truth slowly began to emerge, the world was forced to reckon with the question: what price are we willing to pay for progress? Is there a line that science should not cross, or is there no limit to what we should be willing to sacrifice in the name of discovery? This is the story of the classified experiment that produced a living specimen, a story that remains shrouded in mystery and intrigue to this day. As we delve deeper into the details of the experiment, we will uncover the truth behind one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of science. But be warned, the answers we find may not be as comforting as we hope. The dark, forbidden truth of 1906 Berlin is not one that can easily be forgotten. And once we begin to peel back the layers of secrecy, there is no telling what horrors we may uncover. At the dawn of the 20th century, the world was caught in the throes of unprecedented change. The sweeping currents of industrialization, modernization, and scientific discovery were reshaping not just the physical world, but the very understanding of humanity's place within it. But while progress was celebrated on one hand, there were darker currents running beneath the surface, currents that threatened to drag mankind into a moral abyss from which there might be no return. Berlin, a city that had long been regarded as the intellectual capital of Europe, became a crucible of this evolving tension between progress and morality. It was a place where the brightest minds from all corners of the continent gathered, eager to push the limits of human knowledge. But what many failed to realize at the time was that the very scientific progress being hailed as the triumph of reason would soon give rise to experiments that would forever challenge the boundaries of ethics, humanity, and even life itself. This was not a world where science was simply seeking to cure diseases or ease suffering. Berlin in 1906 was a city on the brink of dangerous, uncharted waters, where the pursuit of knowledge began to show signs of detaching from the moral framework that had governed human society for centuries. In this heady climate of intellectual fervor, scientists and doctors, inspired by the promises of genetics and evolution, started entertaining ideas that would once have been considered unthinkable. Influenced by the evolving theories of Darwinism, eugenics, and the growing understanding of human biology, these men of science began to see themselves not just as seekers of truth but as masters of the natural world. The idea of controlling life, bending nature to fit the ambitions of the mind, became a tantalizing prospect. And for many, the question was no longer should we do this, but rather what would happen if we could. Berlin's medical and scientific community was not unfamiliar with radical ideas. The city had already seen its share of controversial and cutting-edge research, including some of the early pioneers in bacteriology and psychology. But what set the events of 1906 apart was their sheer audacity. The experiment being conducted in secret was not simply an attempt to manipulate a single aspect of life, but rather an attempt to control the essence of life itself. It was an attempt to create a living organism, not by natural processes, but through scientific intervention, a task that would push the boundaries of what was known and risk venturing into the unknown. And it wasn't only the possibilities of scientific achievement that captivated these minds, it was the raw, almost primal desire to transcend the limitations of mortality and natural law. What if science could free humanity from the shackles of death itself? What if life could be controlled, altered, and even manufactured on demand? This vision of progress, however, was deeply entangled with the political, social, and philosophical ideologies of the time. The early 20th century was a time when ideas of racial purity, national superiority, and the improvement of the human race through selective breeding and genetic manipulation were gaining momentum. In Germany, the rise of eugenics and its emphasis on controlling human reproduction were starting to make their way into mainstream scientific thought. These theories, rooted in a misguided understanding of genetics and evolution, were dangerously simplistic and often rooted in racial prejudice. They promised a better future for the human race, but at a profound moral cost. As these ideas gained ground, they became intertwined with more dangerous ideologies. The concept of racial hygiene, and the belief that certain races were superior to others were increasingly normalized in academic and governmental circles. This climate of scientific zeal, mixed with nationalism and social Darwinism, created a perfect storm for the kind of experiments that would be carried out behind the scenes in Berlin. The lines between humanism and inhumanity, compassion and cruelty, began to blur, and the moral compass of many scientists was lost in the pursuit of knowledge. It was in this environment that the experiment would unfold, a dark convergence of ambition, ideology, and blind scientific curiosity. As scientists within Berlin's most prestigious institutions began to formulate their plans, they weren't just responding to the prevailing attitudes of the time. They were pushing the boundaries of science as they understood it, seeking to pioneer a new era of human existence. The pressure to make groundbreaking discoveries, to be the first to achieve what had once been considered impossible, was immense. The world was watching, waiting for the next great leap forward in scientific understanding. And Berlin, with its long history of intellectual achievement, was the perfect place for these radical ideas to take root. The experiment itself was conceived as a way to prove that life could be created or manipulated in ways previously thought impossible. This wasn't about theoretical musings or philosophical debates. It was about tangible, real-world achievement. But in their pursuit of knowledge, the scientists failed to fully account for the ethical consequences of their actions. The experiment was not conducted in a vacuum. It was embedded in a larger cultural moment that saw the advent of new technologies, the rapid advance of medical science, and the discovery of new principles of biology and genetics. The promise of a new science was on the horizon, one that could rewrite the very rules of life. The growing understanding of the human body, the power of the genetic code, and the potential to manipulate biological processes opened new doors. But in doing so, they also revealed just how fragile the line between responsible science and dangerous experimentation truly was. What made the Berlin experiment so troubling was not simply the ambition behind it, but the willingness to disregard the sanctity of life. The scientists behind the project weren't just dealing with abstract theories, they were dealing with real lives, whether human or animal. And the consequences of their actions would be felt long after the project was over. The world, after all, had yet to come to terms with the potential consequences of a world where science no longer had any boundaries. Would humanity be prepared to live with the fallout of such discoveries, or would they find themselves caught in the snare of their own creations? Even though the broader public had little knowledge of the experiment, the ethical debate surrounding it was already taking root within scientific circles. For some, the ambition to create life or manipulate the natural world was seen as a necessary step in advancing human knowledge and progress. But for others, particularly those who saw science as a tool to better human life, the idea of pushing science to such extremes was considered not just reckless, but unethical. The tension between these two schools of thought would eventually become the foundation for the ethical debates that are still being discussed today. And yet, despite the growing unease, there were those who were determined to continue, to push further, to prove that the boundaries of life and death were not as immutable as they once seemed. The voices of dissent were drowned out by the promises of glory, recognition, and the allure of achieving what no one had before. The experiment in Berlin was, in many ways, a culmination of these conflicting forces, a symbol of mankind's desire to master the natural world, regardless of the costs. But at what cost? The questions that arose from these actions would echo through time. Were the scientific community and society at large willing to accept the consequences of such progress? Could they ever truly make peace with the line that had been crossed in the name of knowledge? And could they even recognize the moment when the pursuit of science had crossed into something darker? As Berlin's intellectual scene continued to evolve, the dark shadow of this experiment lingered in the background. Its legacy would go on to influence not just the field of science, but the very way in which we think about the ethical boundaries of human progress. The experiment in 1906 was not just an isolated incident. It was a harbinger of the moral dilemmas that would follow in the wake of the scientific revolutions of the 20th century. And as we look back on it now, we are left with the unsettling realization that the line between brilliance and madness is often far thinner than we would like to believe. In order to understand the full scope of the classified experiment in 1906 Berlin, one must first take a closer look at the men who orchestrated it. These were not ordinary scientists, nor were they simply driven by the desire to advance human knowledge for the sake of the greater good. The architects of this dark chapter in history were individuals whose ambitions, motivations, and intellectual pursuits would forever be intertwined with the moral and ethical consequences of their actions. Behind their calculated brilliance lay a deep thirst for power, for control, and for recognition in a world where scientific progress was valued above all else. At the heart of the experiment were a group of men who, on the surface, seemed no different from other renowned scientists of the time. They were respected figures within their fields, highly educated, and capable of great intellectual feats. Yet beneath this facade of respectability lay a desire to push the limits of science, to achieve what others could not even imagine, no matter the cost. These men were not content with the traditional boundaries of scientific exploration. They sought to break through those boundaries and create something that would be remembered for all time. Their names were not the household ones that history remembers, and in many cases, their roles in the experiment would be buried beneath layers of secrecy and shame. But their drive to alter the course of scientific history was undeniable. The leader of the group, an esteemed geneticist, had long been fascinated by the potential for science to control life. He viewed the human body as a machine, one that could be understood, dissected, and reprogrammed just like any other. His vision was radical. He saw the possibility of creating life through artificial means, not by the natural processes of reproduction, but through the precise manipulation of genetic material. This concept of controlling life had become a powerful obsession for him, one that went beyond the conventional boundaries of scientific curiosity. He believed that humanity's future lay not in the understanding of life, but in the ability to control and even create it. For him, the experiment was the ultimate manifestation of this belief, a chance to demonstrate that science could transcend the limits of nature itself. But the geneticist was not alone in his ambitions. His closest colleagues were equally driven by their own visions of what science could achieve. One of them, a renowned biologist, was particularly drawn to the idea of immortality. He had spent much of his career studying the aging process and the ways in which cells decay over time. But unlike other biologists who sought to understand and perhaps slow down the aging process, he wanted to defeat it altogether. His ultimate goal was to find a way to halt the decay of life, to freeze the aging process in its tracks. In his mind, the creation of a living specimen, something neither fully alive nor fully dead, was a step toward this immortality. If they could achieve this, then perhaps they could unlock the secret to eternal life. It was a tantalizing thought, one that haunted him day and night. The idea of immortality was not just an academic pursuit for him. It was an obsession that consumed his every waking thought. The third member of the group, a medical doctor with a deep interest in human physiology, was motivated by a very different set of concerns. Unlike his colleagues, he was less interested in immortality or genetic manipulation. Instead, his focus was on the concept of life itself. He believed that by artificially creating a living organism, he could answer fundamental questions about the nature of existence. What defined life? What separated the living from the dead? His interest was more philosophical than practical, and yet it was this intellectual curiosity that ultimately led him down a path that would forever alter the trajectory of his career. In his mind, creating a living specimen was not just about breaking the rules of biology. It was about proving that life was not a mystery that had to be accepted, but something that could be understood, controlled, and manipulated. While the members of the group each had their own motivations and intellectual pursuits, they shared a common drive, a desire to achieve something that had never been done before. They were not content with the steady pace of scientific discovery. They wanted to make a mark on history, to do something so revolutionary that their names would be forever linked with the advancement of human knowledge. In their eyes, the potential consequences of their actions were secondary to the achievement itself. The thrill of discovery was so intoxicating that it overshadowed any concerns about ethics or morality. The idea of creating a living specimen, something that existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor dead, was their way of reaching for immortality, for glory, and for the ultimate validation of their intellectual abilities. The secrecy surrounding their project was not merely a precaution, it was a necessity. These men knew that what they were attempting to achieve was highly controversial, and they feared the backlash from both the scientific community and the general public. If word got out about the nature of their experiment, they risked not only their careers but their reputations as well. The world was not ready for what they were about to do. The ethical questions surrounding the manipulation of life were complex and troubling, and the potential for public outrage was immense. They had to keep their work hidden, operating in the shadows where their actions would not be scrutinized by those who might oppose them. As the experiment began to take shape, the team worked in isolation, surrounded by the quiet hum of laboratory equipment and the sterile walls of their research facility. They labored day and night, driven by their shared vision, but also by an ever-growing sense of desperation. The closer they came to achieving their goal, the more consumed they became with the idea of success. They were no longer simply scientists, they were pioneers on the frontier of human knowledge, and their pursuit of the unknown had become an obsession. They believed that they were on the cusp of something monumental, something that would change the world forever. But what they failed to realize was that their pursuit was not just reckless, it was dangerous. The closer they came to creating a living specimen, the more they began to understand just how fragile the boundary between life and death truly was. And once they crossed that line, there would be no turning back. The members of the team were not without their doubts. There were moments of hesitation, moments when the enormity of what they were doing would creep into their minds, if only for a fleeting second. But those doubts were always drowned out by the promise of success, by the allure of the unknown. They convinced themselves that they were justified in their actions, that the risks were worth the potential rewards. They were scientists, after all. They were driven by the pursuit of knowledge, by the belief that humanity could achieve greatness if only it dared to reach beyond the stars. And this experiment, they convinced themselves, was the key to unlocking that greatness. But as the experiment progressed, something began to change. The results of their work were not as clean, as controlled, as they had anticipated. The specimen they were attempting to create, that fragile bridge between life and death, began to take on a life of its own. It was no longer just a scientific curiosity, it was a living entity, one that defied their understanding and expectations. The ambition that had once driven them forward now gave way to fear. The power they had sought to wield now seemed dangerous and uncontrollable. In those final moments before the experiment reached its tragic conclusion, the scientists were faced with the realization that they had gone too far. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the consequences of their actions would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The creation of the living specimen, the culmination of their greatest ambition, would forever be marked by the tragedy of its existence. And for the scientists who had made it all possible, the cost of their ambition would be measured not in the accolades they had hoped for, but in the haunting memory of what they had done. The classified experiment in Berlin, carried out in 1906, was no simple scientific undertaking. It was a calculated, deliberate effort to transcend the boundaries of life and death, to create a living specimen that existed in a state of unnatural limbo. This was not a search for new cures or vaccines, nor was it an exploration of a new facet of nature. It was an experiment with the very essence of life itself, one that would push the limits of biology to the point of distortion, one that would bend the laws of nature, if only for a brief moment in time. The experiment's genesis began with an audacious hypothesis. Could life itself be created or manipulated outside the natural processes of reproduction? Could a living organism be engineered in such a way that it straddled the line between life and death, defying the rules that govern biological existence? The scientists involved in the experiment were deeply fascinated by these questions, driven not only by intellectual curiosity but also by an underlying desire to master the forces of nature. To them, this was a golden opportunity to write a new chapter in the annals of science, one that would forever change humanity's understanding of life itself. The process was complex, rooted in the very science of genetics, but it was also imbued with a certain darkness, an almost necromantic element. The idea was to create a living specimen not by the conventional means of conception, but through artificial methods that would manipulate life at the most fundamental level. The plan was to push the boundaries of what could be considered life, introducing an entirely new form of existence, one that was neither fully alive nor fully dead. To achieve this, the scientists utilized an array of experimental techniques, combining elements of biology, physiology, and even primitive understandings of genetics. One of the most critical elements of the experiment was the concept of suspended animation. The team sought to create a state in which an organism could exist without fully living, where its biological functions were frozen in time. In essence, they were attempting to halt the processes of life that were responsible for growth, aging, and decay, yet without crossing over into death. The scientists believed that if they could achieve this balance, they could preserve life indefinitely, creating a new state of existence that would transcend the biological limitations imposed by nature. This state, in their minds, would open the door to infinite possibilities, from medical applications to the potential for immortality itself. The experiment involved a carefully selected subject, one that would serve as the vessel for this unprecedented manipulation. The subject chosen was not fully human, but an organism that, in many ways, resembled humans in its physiological processes. It was a complex and difficult choice, as the scientists understood that to work with a human subject was not only dangerous but would almost certainly lead to public outrage. Instead, They selected a specimen that was less controversial, but still rich in the biological complexity that would allow them to test their hypothesis. Once the subject was secured, the team began to put their plan into action. They first began by halting the natural processes of life, using a combination of freezing techniques and chemical treatments to bring the organism to a standstill. The goal was not to kill the specimen but to slow or stop its biological functions entirely, to halt the heart, brain, and organs without inducing irreversible death. The scientists were fully aware that they were walking a fine line, that they were on the verge of achieving something that could fundamentally alter the definition of life itself. Over time, the team's techniques grew more refined. They experimented with various methods to manipulate the biological systems of the specimen, attempting to control the metabolism, the circulatory system, the nervous system, essentially, every vital function of life. Their aim was not to kill the specimen, but to manipulate it, to bring it into a state where it existed in a form of suspended animation, caught between life and death. This was not a simple experiment, nor was it a clean or easy process. The scientists encountered setbacks and failures, each one pushing them closer to the limits of what they understood about biology, but also leading them deeper into moral ambiguity. The process was grueling and harrowing. The specimen underwent a series of physiological changes that baffled the researchers, who were eager to document every step of the journey. Despite their intellectual drive, they could not entirely escape the nagging realization that they were engaging in something that went beyond the bounds of what could be ethically justified. Yet, each new development brought with it a sense of exhilaration, the thrill of discovery. They were on the verge of something unimaginable, a step toward understanding life itself, and perhaps even controlling it. As the experiment progressed, the specimen's condition became increasingly difficult to interpret. The techniques used by the scientists were not perfect, and the organism began to exhibit signs of life that were both fascinating and disturbing. At times, it seemed as though the specimen was caught in a strange, indeterminate state, neither fully alive nor completely dead. Its heart, once frozen, would occasionally beat with a strange irregularity. The brainwaves, once still, would flicker with occasional activity. These signs were not enough to suggest full consciousness, but they hinted at something deeper, something beyond the realm of natural life. The specimen seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, as if it were caught in some strange limbo between two worlds. The scientists, despite their growing unease, were elated. They had done it. They had created something new. They had successfully manipulated the natural process of life. They had transcended death without fully achieving it. But this success came at a price that would become painfully clear as the experiment continued. The team's work had become a delicate balancing act. The more they manipulated the specimen, the more unpredictable it became. The lines between life and death began to blur, and the scientists found themselves unable to control the very thing they had created. What they had once seen as a masterpiece of scientific ingenuity began to take on a more sinister quality. As the weeks passed, the specimen's condition deteriorated in unexpected ways. Despite the initial success, the organism began to show signs of physical distress. The balance that had been carefully maintained was beginning to unravel. The organism's tissues began to decay, its organs began to fail, and the unnatural state of suspended animation that had been achieved began to give way to an irreversible collapse. The more the scientists tried to intervene, the more the specimen seemed to resist, its body rejecting the very process that had kept it alive. What had begun as an achievement in life manipulation had turned into a horrific display of nature's relentless power. Despite their best efforts, they had failed to control life, and in doing so, they had created something that was both an unnatural horror and a tragic testament to their ambition. At this point, the scientists were faced with a choice: continue their work and risk pushing the specimen further toward an irreversible state of decay, or abandon the experiment altogether. The consequences of their actions had become apparent. The specimen, once a symbol of their brilliance, was now a grotesque shadow of what it had been. The more they tried to understand and control it, the more it slipped through their grasp. They had created a living organism, but they had failed to give it life in any meaningful sense. It had become something entirely different, something neither fully alive nor fully dead, something that defied all known biological principles. In the end, the experiment came to an abrupt and tragic conclusion. The living specimen, once suspended in a fragile state between life and death, finally succumbed to the inevitable decay that all living things face. It was a failure, though one that would be hidden from the world for decades. The scientists, unable to reconcile their ambition with the moral and biological implications of their actions, chose to bury the results of the experiment. The specimen's existence, and the catastrophic failure of the experiment, would remain classified, hidden from public view for years to come. But the implications of their work were profound. What they had done was not simply a scientific failure, it was a moral one. They had reached too far, pushing beyond the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, and in doing so, they had lost control of their creation. The desire to manipulate life had led them into a perilous moral abyss, where the cost of progress was measured not in accolades, but in the tragic consequences of their ambition. And as the world would eventually learn, the true legacy of their experiment was not one of scientific glory, but of dark, irreversible consequences. As the experiment in Berlin continued to unfold, the central focus shifted onto the first test subject, the living specimen at the heart of the scientists' audacious ambitions. It was a creature that was neither fully alive nor entirely dead, caught in a disturbing state of suspended animation. This subject, whose identity would remain concealed for many years, played a crucial role in the broader scope of the experiment. It wasn't merely a biological specimen, it was a symbol of humanity's desire to break free from the shackles of mortality, an attempt to control the very essence of life and death. The choice of the subject was a complex one. It needed to be something that offered the right mix of biological complexity and flexibility, capable of withstanding the extreme and often unnatural treatments that were to be employed. But it couldn't be so closely related to humans that the ethical ramifications would immediately lead to public outcry. In the end, the scientists chose an organism that bore a resemblance to humanity in terms of its physiological processes but was less likely to provoke outrage. It was a being whose body contained the potential for the kind of manipulation the researchers sought, yet its lack of direct human identity offered a certain degree of plausible deniability. To them, it was a tool, a vessel for their grand experiment. The process of preparing the subject for the experiment was methodical, rooted in the idea that life could be interrupted and controlled at its most fundamental level. The first step was to induce a state of hibernation or stasis, essentially freezing the biological processes that would typically signal life. The team used a combination of cold-induced techniques and chemical agents designed to preserve the subject's body at the brink of death without fully crossing that threshold. Their objective wasn't just to halt the natural processes of life, but to maintain the organism in a fragile, liminal state where it would neither age nor decay, neither be alive in a conventional sense nor dead in the accepted biological understanding. The first signs of success came when the subject's heartbeat was halted. The doctors, their hands steady despite the monumental nature of the task, used a series of chemicals to induce a state of suspended circulation. The organism's organs, normally pulsing with life, became eerily still, as though the very breath of existence had been drawn out of it. For a moment, it seemed that the team had achieved their goal. The creature was suspended between life and death. There was no heartbeat, no movement, yet it wasn't truly dead. And this, the scientists believed, was the key. The specimen's transition into this suspended state was not perfect, however. Though the heart had stopped and the brain had entered a form of stasis, the cells continued to undergo some metabolic processes. It was as if the body, despite the interventions, was still clinging to life in some capacity. What the scientists hadn't anticipated was the strange nature of this limbo. The specimen's body seemed to flicker between states of activity and dormancy. It was almost as though it existed in a continuous cycle, alive one moment and dormant the next, unable to fully die or live. The researchers were both fascinated and disturbed by what they saw. This was no ordinary state of suspended animation. It was something far more complex and, perhaps, more dangerous. As the weeks passed, the scientists' manipulation of the organism continued. They tried to push the limits of what they could control, experimenting with the subject's metabolism, circulation, and neural activity. They injected various compounds, hormones, and enzymes, attempting to alter the biological rhythms of the creature's body. But the more they experimented, the more unpredictable the results became. The specimen's body began to exhibit strange behaviors. Sometimes it would twitch, as if trying to reanimate, and at other times, it would remain completely still. Its cellular structure, once thought to be frozen in time, began to show signs of degradation, and yet, it wasn't dead. It existed in a state of perpetual flux, neither decaying nor thriving. The scientists were quick to document everything they saw, cataloguing each new phenomenon as it arose. Yet, with each breakthrough came a deeper sense of unease. The test subject, a creature that was meant to serve as the key to their scientific triumph, had become something more, a grotesque reminder of the cost of tampering with the natural order. The more the scientists manipulated it, the more the creature seemed to resist. Its body, which had once been so malleable, now appeared to push back against the interventions, as though it was trying to fight its unnatural existence. At times, the subject would exhibit signs of life that were truly alarming. The researchers had hoped that their methods would leave the organism in a kind of suspended stasis, frozen in time, untouched by the usual processes of aging and decay. But it became evident that the organism was not simply frozen, it was changing in ways that defied all understanding. The cells in its body began to multiply and divide, but not in the organized, controlled manner they had expected. Instead, the growth was erratic, a chaotic attempt at life that seemed to be trapped in a paradoxical state of overactivity. The tissue showed signs of regeneration, but it was a grotesque and unnatural regeneration. The organism wasn't merely suspended, it was struggling, fighting against the very nature of its existence. Despite these signs of turmoil, the scientists pressed forward. They began to recognize that the creature's reaction to their interventions was an important part of the experiment. Perhaps the chaos in its body was evidence of something deeper, an indication that life could be manipulated, even beyond the limits of its natural processes. But this realization was tempered by a growing fear. They had pushed the specimen too far. They had crossed a threshold that even they, with all their knowledge and expertise, could not understand. And yet, despite their apprehension, they continued. The pursuit of knowledge, the desire to achieve what had never been done before, was too powerful to resist. Then, as if to remind the scientists of the precariousness of their position, the subject's condition began to deteriorate rapidly. The very foundation of their experiment, creating a living specimen suspended between life and death, began to crumble before their eyes. The organism, which had once appeared to be frozen in a limbo of existence, now showed signs of an irreversible collapse. Its organs began to shut down in a way that they hadn't expected. Its circulatory system, which had been temporarily halted, started to experience violent spasms, as though it were fighting against the unnatural state in which it had been forced to remain. And yet, despite these signs of distress, the creature didn't die. It wasn't dead. It lingered on, caught between two opposing forces, life and death, unable to break free from the state they had created for it. The failure was both profound and inevitable. The scientists, for all their brilliance, had underestimated the complexity of life itself. They had thought they could control it, manipulate it, shape it to their will. But in the end, they had created something neither fully alive nor fully dead, a creature that defied the very essence of biology. It was an entity that existed in a constant state of agony, its very existence a mockery of the natural world. The more the scientists tried to control it, the more it seemed to fight back, as if to assert its own autonomy. They had created a living being, but it was a being that couldn't truly live, and that couldn't die. It was a creature suspended in a hellish void of existence. As the specimen's condition worsened, the scientists found themselves trapped in a moral and ethical dilemma that they had never anticipated. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the creature that they had once viewed as a triumph of science had now become a grotesque testament to their ambition. It was no longer a symbol of scientific achievement, it was a symbol of failure, of the dangers of meddling with forces that should never be tampered with. Eventually, the specimen's body succumbed to the irreversible effects of the experiment. Despite all their efforts to preserve it, the organism finally began to disintegrate, its body deteriorating in a way that was as unnatural as the methods used to create it. The scientists, once so consumed by the desire to master life itself, were left to confront the tragic consequences of their work. What had started as a bold and dangerous experiment had ended in a disaster, leaving nothing but the haunting memory of what had been attempted. The fate of the specimen became a symbol of the experiment's ultimate failure. It was not the living triumph that the scientists had hoped for. It was a tragic and eerie reminder of the perils of playing God, of attempting to control that which should remain beyond human reach. The specimen had never truly been alive. It had only existed in a liminal space, a cruel mockery of life itself. And in the end, it had died not because of the natural course of life, but because of the unnatural forces that had been imposed upon it. The experiment, for all its promise, had ultimately failed, leaving behind a legacy of moral ambiguity and scientific hubris. The failure of the experiment in Berlin was not simply a moment of scientific miscalculation. It was the beginning of a deeper, more troubling realization about the nature of the pursuit itself. As the scientists who had conducted the experiment reflected on the aftermath, they were forced to confront the profound consequences of their actions. The experiment, which had once seemed like a breakthrough, a way to manipulate life and death, to create a living specimen that existed in a space between the two, had ultimately revealed the fragility of their understanding of life itself. It had exposed the dangers of overreaching, of pushing the boundaries of knowledge without fully comprehending the moral and ethical consequences that might follow. In the wake of their failure, the question lingered in the minds of the researchers: what had they truly learned? The failed experiment had exposed the limits of scientific ambition. It had demonstrated that there were forces beyond human control, that life, in its most fundamental form, could not be easily manipulated or bent to the will of science. The notion that life could be suspended, controlled, or created artificially had seemed like a tantalizing possibility at the start of the project. The scientists, driven by the allure of immortality and the prospect of rewriting the very laws of biology, had become blinded by their desire for success. They had sought to create a new form of life, one that could defy the natural cycles of birth, growth, and death. But what they had instead created was a living nightmare, a creature trapped in an agonizing state between life and death, unable to fulfill either role. The most haunting aspect of the experiment was not just the failure itself, but the profound ethical implications it raised. The scientists had crossed a line that could not be undone. They had experimented on a living organism, manipulating its biological processes without regard for the potential consequences. The subject had not been a mere tool. It had been a living being, one that had experienced suffering and confusion in its altered state. The question of whether the specimen had been truly conscious, whether it had felt the effects of the experiment, was one that the researchers could never fully answer. But the eerie signs of life, the strange flickers of movement, the irregular heartbeats, all of these suggested that the creature had, in some way, been aware of its existence, and perhaps even its suffering. For the scientists involved, the failure of the experiment was not merely a disappointment, it was a deep moral crisis. They had crossed a boundary in their quest for knowledge, and the results had been catastrophic. The creature they had created had not been a triumph of science. It had been a grotesque failure, a distortion of life that had come at the cost of its own existence. The ambiguity of the subject's condition, its struggles to exist, and the gradual deterioration of its body had forced the researchers to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of life itself. In the pursuit of knowledge, they had treated a living being as an object, as a tool to be manipulated and controlled. The scientific hubris that had driven them to undertake the experiment now stood in stark contrast to the reality of what they had done. As the scientific community continued to advance in the years following the Berlin experiment, the implications of this failed project would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The legacy of the experiment was not one of glory, but of caution, a reminder that there were limits to what science should attempt to control. The desire to transcend the natural limits of life was, in many ways, a reflection of humanity's broader desire for immortality, for a way to conquer death. But in the end, the experiment had shown that death could not be so easily defied. The very act of trying to control life had resulted in a grotesque distortion, a twisted mockery of what it meant to be truly alive. This realization was not lost on the scientific community, though it was not immediately embraced. At the time, there were still many who believed that the manipulation of life was a worthy pursuit, that the ability to control biological processes would ultimately lead to advancements in medicine, in genetics, and in human longevity. Yet, the dark shadow of the Berlin experiment loomed over these debates. It had shown, in no uncertain terms, that the manipulation of life was not without its risks. The creature that had been created in the name of science was, at best, an unsettling anomaly. At worst, it was a living testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition. The scientific community, in its reflection on the failed experiment, found itself at a crossroads. On the one hand, there was the undeniable allure of discovery, the promise of breakthroughs that could change the course of human history. On the other hand, there was the moral weight of what had been done. The question was no longer whether science could achieve great things, but whether it should. Should humanity pursue the ability to control life and death, to bend nature to its will, without considering the broader implications? Was it ethical to play with the very essence of existence, knowing that doing so could result in suffering, destruction, or worse? In the years that followed, the question of ethics in scientific experimentation would become more prominent, particularly as advancements in genetics, biotechnology, and medicine continued to accelerate. The Berlin experiment served as an early warning, a reminder of the potential dangers that lay ahead if science was allowed to progress without ethical constraints. But while the moral and ethical dilemmas raised by the experiment were significant, they were not always heeded. The thirst for knowledge, for progress, continued to drive many in the scientific community, even as the ghosts of the Berlin experiment haunted their work. What was perhaps most troubling about the experiment was that, despite its failure, it had managed to leave behind a lasting legacy. The results of the experiment had been buried, kept from the public eye, hidden away in the archives of history. But the shadow of what had been attempted, what had been done, lingered. For the scientists involved, the question of how they could have been so blind to the ethical consequences of their actions remained unanswered. How had they allowed themselves to become so consumed by their ambition that they had overlooked the basic humanity of their subject? How had they justified their work, even as they knew, deep down, that they were crossing lines that should never have been crossed? The legacy of the Berlin experiment is not simply one of failure, it is one of tragic hubris, of an ambition that blinded its creators to the deeper consequences of their actions. The scientists who had set out to transcend the limits of life had, in the end, created a tragedy, a distorted form of existence that could not thrive, could not live, and could not die. It was an experiment that served as a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of the need for science to operate within moral and ethical boundaries. In the decades that followed, the scientific community would continue to grapple with these questions. The pursuit of immortality, the desire to conquer death, and the ambition to manipulate life itself would remain ever-present themes in the fields of genetics and biotechnology. But the Berlin experiment had shown that such pursuits could lead to dangerous consequences. It had demonstrated that science, when untethered from ethical considerations, could create horrors far worse than any disease or natural catastrophe. It had exposed the fragility of life itself, and the need to approach the mysteries of existence with humility, respect, and caution. Ultimately, the experiment in Berlin did not lead to the breakthroughs that its creators had hoped for. It did not unlock the secret to eternal life, nor did it grant humanity control over the natural world. Instead, it left behind a painful reminder of the limitations of science, and of the dark places that ambition can lead when it is not tempered by ethical responsibility. The question, then, was not whether science could achieve greatness, but whether it should ever seek to go beyond the boundaries of what is natural. And in the case of the Berlin experiment, the answer was clear. Some boundaries are meant to remain intact, for to cross them is to risk losing something far more precious than knowledge itself. The aftermath of the Berlin experiment, though hidden from public view for many years, began to reverberate through the scientific community in subtle but profound ways. The tragic failure of the project, with its grotesque results and moral implications, left a mark not just on those directly involved, but on the entire field of biological and medical research. It was a failure that exposed the dangers of unrestrained scientific ambition and forced many to reckon with the ethical boundaries that should govern such endeavors. The legacy of the Berlin experiment was not one of triumph, but rather one of caution, a reminder that science, while capable of great achievements, can also yield terrifying consequences when driven by unchecked ambition. In the years following the experiment's conclusion, those who had worked on it became increasingly isolated. The fear of public backlash, combined with the deep moral uncertainty that accompanied their actions, led many of them to retreat from the scientific community. Some even distanced themselves from the project entirely, erasing any evidence of their involvement. The weight of what they had done, and the horror of the creature they had created, became too much to bear. The project had promised so much, but in the end, it had delivered only a monstrous failure, a stark reminder that some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. For those who remained in the field, the Berlin experiment served as an object lesson in the importance of ethical responsibility in scientific research. The lesson was clear. Scientific progress, no matter how promising, must always be tempered with a deep understanding of the moral consequences that might arise from such endeavors. The failure of the Berlin project was not simply about the inability to create a living specimen suspended between life and death. It was about the cost of such a pursuit. What had started as a scientific endeavor had ended in a moral and ethical quagmire, one that no amount of intellectual curiosity could justify. The scientific community, however, did not immediately abandon its pursuit of the unknown. While the Berlin experiment may have cast a long shadow over the field, it also spurred an intense debate about the role of ethics in research. There were still those who believed that the potential for breakthrough discoveries, for the manipulation of life itself, was worth the risks. Some argued that humanity had always pushed the boundaries of what was possible, and that the failure of a single experiment should not deter future efforts. But others, haunted by the images of the failed specimen and the knowledge that the experiment had crossed moral lines, called for a new approach to scientific inquiry, one that prioritized ethical considerations as much as, if not more than, the pursuit of knowledge. In the decades that followed, The ethical debate surrounding the manipulation of life, particularly in the realms of genetics and biotechnology, would only grow more urgent. The scientific community began to realize that, while progress was essential for the advancement of society, it could not come at the cost of the very principles that made scientific inquiry meaningful. The question was no longer whether science could achieve great things, but whether it should. Could humanity, in its pursuit of immortality, of control over life itself, risk losing its humanity in the process? Could the boundaries between life and death be crossed without dire consequences? As new advancements in genetics and biotechnology emerged, the memory of the Berlin experiment continued to loom large. It was a cautionary tale, one that reminded researchers of the fine line between innovation and ethical responsibility. The possibility of manipulating life on a genetic level, of altering the fundamental building blocks of existence, was an alluring one. Yet, the more scientists delved into the potential of genetic engineering, cloning, and other forms of life manipulation, the more they realized that the lessons of the Berlin experiment were as relevant as ever. The creature created in Berlin, trapped in its state of suspended animation, had become a symbol of the dangers of pushing scientific boundaries too far. It was a tragic reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, when divorced from ethical considerations, could lead to horrors far worse than ignorance. The failure of the experiment had been a direct consequence of the scientists' failure to fully comprehend the consequences of their actions. They had sought to control life itself, but in doing so, they had created something that was neither fully alive nor fully dead, a grotesque reflection of the darker side of human ambition. For the scientists who had been involved in the project, the failure was personal as well as professional. The creature they had created, the living specimen that had been the focus of their ambition, was a constant reminder of their own hubris. The ethical implications of the experiment haunted them long after its conclusion. Some could not live with the knowledge of what they had done and withdrew from public life, while others continued to work in their respective fields, forever marked by the memory of the project's tragic outcome. But no matter where they went or how they tried to move on, the failure of the Berlin experiment remained with them, a shadow that could not be escaped. The secrecy surrounding the experiment only deepened the mystery and the moral quandaries associated with it. For years, the details of the project were buried in classified files, hidden from the public eye. The scientists involved, fearing both the moral implications of their work and the potential for public outrage, kept their involvement secret. The living specimen they had created, the object of their unrelenting ambition, was kept hidden from the world. The experiment, in the end, was something that could not be shared, for it was not a success to be celebrated, but a failure to be concealed. As time went on, the story of the Berlin experiment became something of a legend, a tale of scientific hubris and the dark consequences of unchecked ambition. The details of the experiment remained hidden, but rumors swirled within the scientific community. Whispers of the monstrous creature created in the name of science, and the moral dilemmas faced by the scientists who had orchestrated its existence, became part of the folklore of the field. It was a cautionary tale, one that served as a warning to future generations of scientists about the dangers of pursuing knowledge without regard for the ethical cost. The legacy of the Berlin experiment, in many ways, became a defining moment in the history of scientific ethics. It was not simply the failure of an experiment, it was the failure of an idea. The notion that life could be manipulated and controlled by human hands had been shattered, and with it, the illusion that science could answer every question, solve every problem, and conquer every limitation. The Berlin experiment had demonstrated, in no uncertain terms, that there were limits to what science could achieve, and that those limits were often defined by the very nature of life itself. In the years following the experiment, as the world witnessed the rise of genetic research and biotechnological advances, the memory of Berlin's failed experiment continued to serve as a reminder of the risks inherent in these pursuits. The advancements in genetic engineering and cloning, while promising incredible breakthroughs, also carried with them the potential for grave consequences. The possibility of manipulating life, of creating beings that were not entirely natural, still loomed large. And the question remained, could humanity learn from the mistakes of the past, or would it continue down the same dark path that had been blazed by the scientists in Berlin? The experiment, long buried and hidden from public knowledge, remained a symbol of the dangers of pushing too far, too fast. It was not just a scientific failure, it was a moral and philosophical one. It had shown that, for all the brilliance of human ingenuity, there were boundaries that should not be crossed. The creature they had created, trapped in its endless cycle of life and death, was a stark reminder that some things were simply beyond human control. In their desire to manipulate life, the scientists had created a monstrosity, one that could not be controlled, and one that could not be undone. The legacy of the Berlin experiment was not one of scientific glory or acclaim. It was a legacy of failure and regret, a warning of the consequences of unchecked ambition and the need for ethical responsibility in scientific endeavors. As the world moved forward into new realms of genetic discovery, the lessons of Berlin could not be forgotten. The price of progress was not always measured in success, but in the lives that might be harmed, the moral lines that might be crossed, and the very essence of what it meant to be human that might be lost along the way.